And we are live. Welcome to another special edition of Dark Lord of Optics Live. That's me trying to sound like a war correspondent. I gotta say that before we kick off, my way of doing war corresponding. I don't know what the right way of saying this. My way of doing war correspondence is the best. I'm far away from any action, behind an ocean, behind the bulk of American military. And since I'm kind of in the center of the continent, I guess maybe slightly closer to the west. If you, given where all the festivities are happening, I don't think you can find a safer spot than where I am now, which honestly I am really rather enjoying. Anyhow, Eugene is joining me. He is logging in. He will nod or give me a thumbs up when he's ready to join. We have a agenda of sorts that we want to cover, starting off really with kind of where we are and hit the highlights. And then there's all sorts of interesting stuff happening with media representation, how the war is supported in Russia or not supported. And I know Eugene has been looking at it probably a good bit more carefully than I have. So we'll see if there's anything interesting to extract there. To kick things off, so we are now, well, I said day 10, technically it's really day 11. We are on day 11 of all this fun. And Russia has definitely made some advances, more so in the south, but it looks like, offhand, it looks like they have reasonably good control over eastern Ukraine. And they have made serious advances up in the south. They captured the city of Kherson and Mariupol and a few others. The way this campaign is going is still looking a little bit bizarre. One thing that is clearly happening, I think, and Eugene will correct me if I'm wrong. One thing that is clearly happening is that the Russians were hoping to sort of blitzkrieg over Ukraine, replace the government, and be happy. Well, that did not happen. The Ukrainians, by and large, look to be very much united against the invasion, if you wish, and being able to capture Ukraine with what you might call, little blood, with few casualties, did not pan out. So now, by all accounts, the Russian military is going after the civilians to a much greater degree than they used to. We're seeing some fairly horrific images come out of it, but so far still does not seem to rise quite to the level of we will just destroy everything. So it's somewhere in between. And I don't know if it's lack of capability or indecision, or they're playing some game that I do not understand. That would not really surprise me in the slightest. Okay. Eugene, are you ready to join? All right. He is ready to join. Let me add him to the stream. Here we go. Let me see how I can get into the middle of this picture and get the earpiece in. That will be helpful. Okay. Excellent. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Now I can hear you. So I think we're good. And before we go into more specifics on media coverage in the world, point out a couple of interesting things, right? So United States is putting sanctions on Russia while continuing to buy, about 600,000 barrels of oil per day, something like that? I think the number.
Right.
While continuing to buy 600,000 barrels of oil per day from Russia. I think there is some cognitive dissonance there, best I can tell. And other fun things are happening, right? So the erstwhile Democrat Party in the United States that is, trying to figure out how to live in this new world. Before they had Trump to talk about, now they don't have Trump. They're trying to tie Trump to Russia. It doesn't seem to be working too well, so they're looking for more fun things to do. I think I heard a interesting suggestion that we should stop buying oil from Russia because we're kind of sanctioning them. That stands to reason. However, instead, and I don't remember which Democrat politician said this for sure. Could have been Jen Psaki actually saying this. I don't remember. Their brilliant idea was instead to buy oil from Iran. I don't think this requires further commentary. You just can't make this shit up, really. Apparently, the idea that we might, drill a little more, maybe get some oil from Canada. They wanted to do this little pipeline called Keystone something. Extra large, extra small. I don't remember. Anyhow, I think we have other options to satisfy our energy needs other than buying oil from Russia and Iran. But what do I really know? I'm just an optics guy. And let's see. Yeah, and one more thing. So Eugene pointed that out when we were talking earlier. So the Biden administration is continuing to negotiate with Iran regarding the Iran nuclear deal and getting it, back up and going, and all that sort of stuff. And Russia is mediating that communication. So we are sanctioning Russia for attacking Ukraine while buying oil from Russia and participating in Russia-mediated talks about nuclear Iran. Did I get it right?
Yeah.
Okay, just making sure I'm not going crazy because it sounds like Twilight Zone, right? I kid you not. Anyhow, before we go into details, you want to add anything to this whole stream of kind of codifying nonsense?
Well, in terms of the theme of current U.S. effort, I think you covered it. We do not know much more. Like, for instance, we know that 70 fighter jets for Ukraine that were promised fell through. And some people speculate that it was under U.S. pressure. I do not know for sure. I have no evidence to point to. We just know that somehow deal disappeared after it was publicly announced.
Yeah, given, like I said, so something to be always keep in mind. So I don't pretend to be unbiased. I'm A, pro-US, B, anti-Russia, and C, I'm a libertarian conservative. So it sounds plausible to me that some idiot within the Biden administration would kill the deal for fighter planes, but I really have no proof. So,
yep.
So that's not happening. So what other fun stuff is do we need to point out early?
I mean, we can talk about the state of Russia before getting into the war itself.
Okay, I think that's a good topic. Go for it.
I mean, on the Russian side, they went into more or less complete information blockade. They cut off Facebook and a few other Western sources of information. They suspended broadcasting on the only two independent TV channels in Russia. They instituted a 3-year sentence for misinformation about the war and 15-year sentence for misinformation that materially inhibits Russian efforts in the war. There were multiple protests in various cities in Russia, most notably in St. Petersburg. My understanding is that jails in St. Petersburg are full right now, and newly arrested people need to be sent to jails to the other cities. Yeah, it's still not a kind of mass movement, but at least those people are very much willing to be arrested at this point.
I mean, that's significant. Being arrested in Russia and sent to jail in Russia, whether it's St. Petersburg or Norilsk, none of that is a picnic. So
yeah, there's information which initially I kind of dismissed as rumors that Putin is out of Moscow. Seems more and more credible because he does not appear in the meetings physically being with anybody from the cabinet. So most likely he did move to undisclosed location.
Okay, that's interesting. So can we? Well, so let's go through the options, right? So why would Putin run off from Moscow?
Well, I mean, I have my own theory. There are kind of the theories that I do not support is that he is preparing for nuclear strike and he is in a bunker somewhere in Siberia where he could withstand a strike.
It's I don't think a bunker like that exists. I mean, but okay.
It may, but this is not my preferred theory. I do think that he's very much afraid of Palace coup, and he wants to at least make it very difficult. So he is away from most of the people who could commit such a coup, and I think that's probably the most likely reason.
Okay, I'm with you on that. Do you think he is concerned about the public outcry and the Russian version of Maidan or something like that?
Again, like never say never. Never in the history of Russia there was an equivalent of Maidan.
Well, I mean, in 1905, as I recall, there was some reasonable uprising and they got slaughtered.
Yeah. So you can definitely.
I think that's probably the closest. So for those of you who didn't go to Russian school, in 1905, some disgruntled workers and peasants decided that all of Russian problems are because of the evil minions, but the Tsar himself just doesn't know that the people are suffering, and they decided to go and talk a little bit about things. None of that worked.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, there was a revolution after all. Tsar was removed from power, but
that was 12 years later.
Exactly, it was not a spontaneous demonstration. So I do not favor a spontaneous demonstration option. I do believe in palace coup. Those have happened in Russian history many times. So
that's not unusual.
Yeah, I do not know how credible it is. It's kind of one of those things you do not know until it happens.
That's fair. That's fair. So Jared here has a question about Putin's statement since the invasion of Ukraine. So any subtlety in what he says, how he says it, something that you can think of that, it's not easy translated to English that could use some commentary?
Actually, I was surprised how persistent he is with phrasing. In the last statement as of yesterday, he did not specifically talk about removing Zelensky, but he still uses denazification, disarmament, etc. So if he's preparing for negotiations, he's definitely playing his cards well. There is no sign that he changes his mind on any of the asks.
How interesting. I mean, honestly, it's not surprising. He was always a strategic and calculating actor, right? There is a persistent theory out there that he's gone completely nuts. That may still be possible, but I wouldn't necessarily discount the guy.
Well, that's so the one interesting piece about his, I think it was yesterday's speech. It was a shift in time in Russia. It could have been 2 days ago, but he, at the end of the speech, he looked positively confused, more like Biden-esque, where he stood up, looked around, took off his jacket, put on his jacket, sat back down. Very much not Putin of a week ago. So clearly there is some stress there.
Well, I mean, it would be amazing if he wasn't stressed. So this question is actually pertinent, and it's probably fairly brief. I'll read out the question if you'll watch on a small screen. What I have personally heard from family in Ukraine is that it's just a matter of time before Russia wins this war. Militarily, yes, right? So I don't think it was ever really a big question that in terms of the military of the war itself, that Russia would be able to beat Ukraine, right? I mean, the guest we had on last week was very optimistic about the abilities of Ukrainian military, as he should, I mean, given his background and all that sort of stuff. But in terms of sheer size and firepower and technological ability, Russia is a major military power. Now, to be clear, right, if you think of first world powers militarily, I mean, that's United States. Russia is not at that level, but they are a major power and they can suppress the military of Ukraine. The bigger question is that will then Ukraine descend into civilian resistance and guerrilla warfare for the next 20 years, right? Kind of like Eastern European version of Afghanistan, except with 40 million people, right?
I guess I'm a little bit more optimistic. So I do not think it's foregone conclusion that Russia will not get definitively bogged down. As you mentioned in the beginning, it doesn't seem like they're completely open to any means of leveling the cities and occupying the land. So they definitely changed the tactics and they feel more comfortable with aerial bombardment, but not yet at the Aleppo or Grozny level.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah.
And if they are not willing to, so I'm, for instance, watching this convoy that was moving from Belarus to Kiev, and it's pretty obvious to me that this convoy does not want to make it to Kiev, or at the very least, they do not want to be the first ones to make it to Kiev. So
yes, that's not surprising. Yeah.
Right. So when you start seeing this type of dynamics, so it's not a matter of like warheads and troops, etc. If like troops that much do not want to fight, this is a strategic game changer. So I do still think that unfortunately Russia is a big country with a lot of resource depth and armament, so they absolutely able to do this. But there is a chance that they actually will get bogged down.
Okay, yeah, that is a reasonable point. Generally, as far as the war goes, so I've been listening to some commentary, right, and there is some very pro-Western commentary, pro-Russian commentary. But one of the interesting things that I saw is that with multiple military analysts, there seems to be some are saying that the primary push of the war is to go forward and take Kiev, while others are saying that Russian military is really focusing on where the Ukrainian military is, which is eastern Ukraine, trying to encircle them, subdue them, etc., before they make a big push for Kiev. And I don't really have a good insight into which is correct.
Another interesting piece that we're watching is what's happening with Odessa. So 2 days ago, supposedly, second half of Russian Marines loaded their 13 ships, moved towards Odessa. This is not a long way to go. They failed to arrive. And Odessa was fully getting ready, and I talked to folks from Odessa. They're fully getting ready to repel the assault, but it doesn't look like Russian Marines are in any rush to start the assault. And they turned back, then they came back with 7 ships, then they turned back, and nobody is really clear what's taking place there.
So that is a fair point, but also it's entirely possible that the ground forces didn't get close enough for the amphibious assault to be happening at the same time. So we really don't know. So Jared makes an interesting point, going back to the U.S., that Biden, the polls for Biden have gone up dramatically since this invasion, which is kind of stunning. And he'd like to ensure that Putin does not achieve success, at least until after the midterm elections in November. Honestly, I don't think Biden has much at this stage. I don't think Biden has much influence on anything that's happening there. I mean, even if we stop buying oil from Russia and completely cut them off from Western financing, I mean, they can last for a while. So I don't know. I don't know if Biden can ride the wave by saying brave sounding things about Putin, but I don't think there's much.
Well, I'm actually not seeing that in most Biden trends, so maybe I'm missing something. But he's at 41%, according to 538, and he has been actually declining plus or minus, for last, pretty steadily.
Are you talking about his IQ or poll numbers?
Poll numbers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just making sure.
So it's not clear that he's seeing some dramatic revival. And again, not only that, I do not think that this is big dramatic calculation.
Yeah. Anyhow, Jared, if you have some sort of a source to where it says that Biden's popularity is improving thanks to all this calamity, please post a link. I would really appreciate it. If you don't have to look for it now, post it in the comments after the video and I'll investigate. Okay. Anyhow, so the most pertinent commentary here really is that from Joe, I'm seeing all kinds of conflicting stuff. And I think the media has made the giants know that, yes, the media finally has something to talk about. But the whole conflicting stuff part is accurate, right? The fog of war is upon us. It's really hard to say what is really, really happening. Okay. Anyhow, we'll go back a little bit to sort of the origins. I'm looking at our notes here, and I'll let Eugene address this. The basic question is that I think one of the dominant narratives in Russia is that Russia did not have a choice, right? That they were forced into this and all that. So let's talk about that a little bit. So did Putin have any other options?
Yeah, I mean,
try to take it seriously. I know it's hard.
I mean, I hear this comment a lot, and for me, I guess there are 2 ways to kind of discuss it. So first of all, it's extremely reminiscent of what Soviet Union said during the Winter Wars. In fact, they staged artillery attack on their own troops to justify the war. It's obviously very reminiscent of Hitler's speeches about reunification of Germany and about Sudetenland, how they were persecuted, etc. So historically, I do not think this is a completely novel play here. Now, people do ask, there was this supposedly verbal commitments to Soviet Union during the dissolution that NATO will not expand and now being threatened by NATO. I mean, you obviously could have a very different picture of the world in which NATO is a military arm of the United States. I view it as fairly loose alliance of free nations, which we spend a lot of time cajoling and trying to get to do things that we want. And more importantly, I'm not a. It's very difficult for me to credibly discuss world in terms of spheres of influence. So I do not believe that country like Russia can dictate their area of influence that the rest of the world has to take seriously. The same way how we do not believe that North Korea can demand that South Korea is their sphere of influence and we should stay out. I don't understand how anybody could credibly view it this way. We have countries that are willingly joining EU and NATO because you do not give up your freedom, versus I'm not aware of any non-dictatorship, not even that, but any dictatorship that was stable that chose Russian patronage, because basically at this point you do give up your entire freedom. You become the vassal state of Russia.
Okay, that's fair. To elaborate a couple of things, Eugene mentioned the Winter War. Winter War was when Soviet Union attacked Finland, claiming that Finland attacked them. Like when we were growing up in the Soviet Union, we all thought that it was Finnish aggression, right? And then kind of grow up a little bit, think about it. So Finland, yay big. Soviet Union, yay big. Aggression? Something there didn't quite compute, and that's what Eugene was referring to. As far as NATO goes, look, like all the NATO countries, 99.99% of the time can't freaking agree on anything. It takes a miracle for them to do anything together. It can kind of function as a defensive alliance, which it sort of is, but you have to press NATO really, really, really hard. I mean, it takes a 9/11 magnitude event to get NATO to do anything together, right? And the whole business about NATO not being on Russian borders is just certified nonsense. If you look at the map, NATO is on Russian borders, right? There's Estonia, Latvia. There's no...
Well, Putin would claim that this is first aggression, and now with Ukraine expressing vocal desire to join, this would be yet another, and there are only so many things they can take. But I don't know. How seriously are we taking claims, rhetorical claims by dictators when they use this playbook over and over again?
Correct. This is not the first time we see this kind of stuff. It happens all the time. Remember when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, right? He was trying to protect the Germans in Sudetenland, right? Kind of like Putin is claiming he's trying to protect Russians in eastern Ukraine. So I saw a comment here from Mr. Second Guess Always, whose family is in Ukraine. He goes, I can see guerrilla warfare in Western Ukraine, but not in Eastern Ukraine. Maybe. Eastern Ukraine, yeah. So what do you consider Eastern Ukraine, right? In some ways, Eastern Ukraine, anything east of the Dnieper River, right? And that's not quite.
So I would challenge this claim basically empirically based on what we see. So we have Kharkov, which is by no means Western Ukraine.
That's fair.
Which has put up quite a determined resistance. In fact, you would say that this was a focal point of Russian attack for the last several days, and they're still holding up. Odessa is known to be ethnically not very Ukrainian, and assumption was that this is yet going to be another easy target, but based on what I hear and see in pictures from the ground, everybody is preparing for all-out war against Russian assault. So it's not obvious to me that there would not be a guerrilla warfare given what they're doing right now.
That's kind of interesting. That's a kind of a cute question. I didn't expect this one. Any idea why Ukraine isn't counterattacking on Russian soil? So many reasons, really. First of all, Ukraine has bigger problems right now. Second, why would Ukraine, if they had the ability and manpower, attack on Russian soil? What would that do?
I think the point is there is no way for Ukraine to mount an attack that would materially undermine Russian industrial strength.
Well, if they had nukes, but aside from that,
Yeah, but it would unify Russia because this would be actually attack on Russia itself. Versus right now, Putin is really threading the needle, trying to explain why it's critical for them to lose a lot of soldiers, and they themselves admitted to at least 500. It's pretty safe to say this is a much larger number. Yeah, I think that there is everything to lose and nothing to gain.
So before we get into the casualties, let's talk a little bit about Russia and like what Russian media is saying, the polls inside Russia. What do the normal Russians think about all of this?
Yeah, so this is a hot topic of dispute between people within Russian community. So the latest polls done by Russian outlet Radio Svoboda the day of invasion. So they're kind of, it's interesting, and poll itself requires interpretation. So if you ask Russians who is guilty for the current situation that they found themselves in, 60% said NATO, 14% said Ukraine, and 3% said Russia. Right. So overwhelmingly, opinion is that it's not a crisis of Russian making. Asking specifically question about the war, 37% of Russians said that they support the war, 42% said that they oppose the war, and roughly 20% did not have a strong opinion one way or another.
So evenly split. I mean, that's within the margin of error, I'm sure.
Correct. So now the question is, what does it mean when you believe that escalation is clearly not Russian fault, but you're against the war? So probably out of this 50-50, some would say that they theoretically against the war, but Russia had to do it. So my claim is at least 50% of Russians are in support of the war.
Okay. That's probably not unreasonable. Do you see any trends? Is it changing as we go along, or is it staying fairly steady for now?
Well, Putin's regime is famous for its real-time fair polling. So right now that basically there is no media, it's very difficult.
Yeah, that's fair, yeah.
There are some videos of people being asked on the street. There is pretty clear divide. So in a big cities, opinions usually skew more anti-war. Not overwhelmingly so, but significantly. And among young people, 30 and under, they tend to be significantly anti-war versus older generation, typically more inclined to believe the Putin's version.
Okay, that's fair. So, and right now, Russia is also, I think they shut down Facebook access in Russia, right?
I mean, they did, but I never heard about VPN. So
I saw a blurb that VPN companies reported that they've had the largest number of single-day VPN downloads in their history, all coming from Russia. So it sounds like Russians are trying to VPN out into the world to see what the hell's happening.
Yeah, so with the people that I'm in touch with, I haven't seen anybody who failed to appear on Facebook as a result.
Okay, got it. Interesting. Okay, so let's address a couple of questions, and then I want to talk a little bit about casualties and misinformation on both sides and all that sort of stuff. Okay, so Joe, kind of a very American statement, and anyone who says no one needs an AR-15 or AK-47 at this point is willfully ignorant and insane. I think they were ignorant and insane always, but that's besides the point. Brooks Precision says his polls, meaning Biden, went up slightly after his speech. Are you talking about the speech where he correctly pointed it out that we are not going to win the hearts and minds of Iranians as a result of our actions in Ukraine? Is that speech? Just making sure. So I suffered through most of that speech. I couldn't freaking believe it, but okay.
Yeah, I mean, the speech, it was impressive in many ways because you could, there are so many things you could have said that were inspirational and decisive, but even the topic of Ukraine was full of platitudes, and it was a fairly small part of the speech anyways.
Yeah. Okay. Joe Morgan, most of what I saw on Vice News were women from Chechnya making Molotovs with used motor oil, so that's not a good sign. So if all you saw on Vice News was women from Chechnya, they covered a very small sliver of Ukrainian population. Right, there is some Chechen expat population in Ukraine, and not exactly a majority, but they do know how to make Molotov cocktails. They've had a lot of practice. Also, Joe, I saw a deal. Ammo Inc. has funded 1 million rounds of AK food to the cause. I bet there's a tax break to some goodwill for new company in Second Amendment world. But they did put money where mouth is. Yeah, a few American companies I saw made statements with that. I did not see if they truly followed through or not. 1 million rounds is not a ton, and honestly, the way Russian war usually works, like during the season fighting, the people in charge of Russian inventory go to the other side and sell ammo to the enemy. So I think Ukrainians are not going to be short in ammo. I mean, in Chechnya, people were making a lot of money that way. Okay, Jared, is the Ukrainian capital pronounced as Kiev or Kiev? So it depends where you're from. So Eugene and I grew up in Russia. We're not from Ukraine, so we grew up saying Kiev. Is it how they pronounce it in English normally? What's the correct pronunciation? Do you know?
Yeah, well, it's again, Ukrainian is Kiev, Russian is Kiev, and right now there is a trend to skew one way for reasons of being sympathetic with Ukrainians. Honestly, Ukrainians that I know could care less how you pronounce it. They're much more interested in.
So I will say, people from Odessa, if you say Odessa, you might get crucified. But Odessa, they're okay with. So. All right, let's see. Jack Bauer. I think Putin thought this would go over as smooth as the incursion into Georgia. Yeah, we've covered that before. He clearly thought it would be a walk in the park, and it clearly isn't. Although there is obviously a lot of detail to this.
Just to kind of resurface some historical facts, definitely incursion to Georgia was not as dramatic as that in Ukraine for Russian military, but it was not smooth either. So they did pre-combat inspection of all Russian vehicles. Most of them did not pass the inspection. Out of the ones that they deemed ready for inspection, 1/3 did not start the following day. And when they went into the battle, turns out that they never practiced radio communication and had a lot of friendly fire accidents. And almost all of the casualties actually were from friendly fire. So, yeah, I don't know if I would call it smooth, but yes.
So, okay, it was smoother than the current Ukrainian exercise, I think. Okay. Yeah, I'm glad to hear your take on this, given your point of origin like Slavs. Yeah, we're not Slavs. We grew up in Russia. We're not Slavs. There is a distinction, probably outside the scope of this discussion. That's interesting. Jared, the stream of foreign fighters into Ukraine is reminiscent of what U.S. forces have faced since 2001. That's actually an interesting point. Maybe, I'm not sure.
So it's pretty hard to quantify. There are other anecdotal stories. We know there were a few battalions of non-Ukrainians fighting on Ukrainian side since 2014. So nothing new there. I do not know. It's safe to say that most of the Ukrainian military strength is not drawn from foreign fighters at the moment, not by a long shot, which is probably not quite the case if you're talking about ISIS in Iraq or something. I think they're much more foreign fighter based.
Yeah, I think that's fair. You have to keep in mind, so a lot of the resistance to the United States in the Middle East was fundamentally religion-based. So it brought in religious people from other parts of the Muslim world. Ukraine is kind of a different ballgame. And also, once again, I never get tired of repeating, Ukraine has 40 million plus people. That's a lot of people. That's not Syria. That's not Afghanistan, right? That's a lot of people. Let's see what else we have. William Brown. Poland stated that they would support insurance of the Ukrainian government. I think the autocorrect strikes again. I'm not entirely sure what you meant. Oh, that's kind of interesting. Jamie, with all the money flowing in from the West, do you think Zelensky will bring in professional operators from South Africa? Do you know anything about professional operators from South Africa?
Nothing.
Yeah, me neither. I'm afraid I don't have an opinion on this, and most importantly, I'm sure there are professional operators in South Africa. I just don't know if they have the numbers, even if they were brought in to sway this war.
I'm curious if you know something specific about South Africa, because most countries have some number of experienced people.
Yeah, so we'll see. We'll see what happens. Okay, so all right. So William Brown corrected his statements as insurgency, right? So that means Poland stated that they would support insurgency if the Ukrainian government failed. Yeah, I think there'll be no shortage of other Eastern European countries tacitly supporting insurgency, because aggressively minded Russia on their borders is not exciting for really anyone.
I'm actually curious how it's going to play out in real life when Russia decides to stage cross-border strikes to destroy camps of Ukrainian insurgents, which is kind of similar to what everybody has to do. We operated in Syria, operated in Pakistan. That does sound like aggression against NATO then.
That's very fair. Okay. Oh, there we go. So Jared found his source. The Hill said that Biden's approval rating jumps to 47% after State of the Union address. I'll look into this. I don't know where the Hill got that poll. I have not seen that number anywhere. Maybe it was CNN staffer poll or something like that. I have no idea.
And I'm sure polls can vary, so I don't think there's any reason not to trust it.
Okay. All right. So here's a good question from Rashad, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about casualties on both sides and stuff like that. What are the chances that this war will undermine Putin's leadership? How does power and control change in Russia? We touched on this a little bit earlier. Will it undermine Putin's leadership? So Putin, well, yeah, Eugene touched on this earlier. I don't think Putin could care less about people in the streets, but he is concerned about generals, oligarchs, and others, taking him out. So basically, palace coup is a more pressing concern for Putin than public opinions. How does power and control change in Russia is really unclear, because it was Soviet Union for a long time, and since then they had two presidents, Gorbachev sort of, then Yeltsin, and then Putin. And last decade of Putin's power, they didn't really have popular elections or anything. So they had elections.
Well, I would claim that in the whole history of Russia, there was never a single instance of genuine transition of power or actual instance of elections whose results were followed in any way.
Well, I mean, I was under the impression when Yeltsin got elected, he actually got elected for whatever, despite my personal feelings about Yeltsin. But
well, I think the interesting thing to note, Yeltsin was not some popular candidate that came out of nowhere. He was the head of Communist Party of Russian Republic. So yes. I would put it more into the palace coup, even if the new face is more friendly to the West.
That's fair.
Yeah, it wasn't a kind of random person that won on popularity.
Okay. Anyhow, so the basic answer to this question is that we don't know exactly how power and control change in Russia. We know how they do not change by democratic means. I think that's probably the best we can do. Right. Let's see. And there are a few questions. We'll get to that in a moment. So, Eugene, you had some good notes about casualties and how both sides show them. So if you want to address that for a few minutes.
Sure, absolutely. So as you can appreciate, so first thing that I think is relevant for people to understand, you will always hear anecdotal stories which turn out to be untrue. Like the reason why I personally didn't repost things about Zmienny Island, because I had no idea if they died, if the account of the story was correct. In this instance, it turned out not to be. It may very well could be. And there are a few more stories. There's kind of the Ghost of Kiev, which sounds exactly the kind of popular story that inspires people. But again, there was no verification, no name attached to it. Most likely, there is no such thing. There were some Air Force operations, and there was some dogfighting that people saw. But general picture is still real, and you can ascertain it in certain ways. So Ukraine at this point claims that 1,941 units of mechanized Russian equipment were destroyed, abandoned, surrendered, etc. So kind of, I was looking for some way to independently verify it. So there is a website that I just posted to for Ilya that does tracking of conflicts, and they try to do their best to have their own tally of casualties. And they make sure that images...
I'm going to put it up and share it while you talk.
Okay. Yeah, so they make sure that images provided, they're not replicated. It's not picture from Syrian war or something. They try to validate the date, the markings on the vehicle, basically everything that you can do from open sources. So they are currently able to verify 725 pieces of Russian military equipment that were destroyed.
This is the website you're talking about, right?
That's correct, yeah. So discrepancy is a factor of 2.6. According to them, this is not unprecedented discrepancy between what you can verify and what happens in reality. So basically, it is quite possible there's overcounting to some degree, but I would be shocked if it's more than by a factor of 2. So if we extrapolate from that, so Ukraine claims over 6,000 Russian personnel killed. So it's safe to say it's more than 3,000, right? And the fact that Russia itself, that typically never admits casualties, and first 3 days they explicitly maintain that there are no casualties on the Russian side. Then they stopped talking about casualties for a day, and then they came out with number 500. It's also safe to say that we're talking about something well in the thousands. What's kind of interesting about this number is that this number is dramatically higher than anything else we've seen in Russian conflicts in Chechnya. First Chechen War, Second Chechen War, Afghanistan. That's pretty unprecedented losses in a period of 9 days.
Yeah, that is indeed significant. So before we move on, this gentleman kindly donated, so I'm going to put it up on the screen. And the question is, why are you spreading propaganda about the Great Liberation and denazification? I don't know if it's supposed to be why aren't you, or if it is supposed to be certain sarcasm that just does not come through the text so much. But I do appreciate you chiming in. It sounds like a little bit of sarcasm, and once again, we'll talk a little bit about the denazification momentarily. But with Zelensky being Jewish, and me and Eugene, right? So we'll have a very particular view on denazification of Ukraine. Yeah, that the continuous claims of denazification of Ukraine is one of the most stunning parts of what we're seeing here, really.
I think the funniest press release about this was when the Russian foreign ministry said that they summoned Israeli ambassador over Israel's support of Nazis. So I guess that's...
Oh, I haven't seen that one. When was that?
So Israel sent a plane of medics to assist in Ukraine, or near border region of Ukraine. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So it's along the same lines where most of the Jews are ardent supporters of Nazis.
Yes, apparently, yeah. Apparently there's such a thing as a 007 Jew. I think he's referring to Zelensky. Hey, could be for all we know. There's so much funny memes about Zelensky and the largest cargo plane in the world, the Mriya, the Antonov 225, was destroyed by Russian bombardment. And the common meme on the internet is now Zelensky cannot travel because no other aircraft can lift his balls off the ground, right? So, but anyhow, so going back to casualties and things like that. So we're seeing much more than we're used to seeing from Russia. Even Russia is admitting to more than they normally do, so that means the real thing is really significantly larger, right? So since the whole Nazification thing came up, let's talk a little bit about the Nazis in Ukraine. You talked about Snake Island before we get to that, and the Ghost of Kiev, so the fighter pilot who allegedly shot down 6 Russian aircraft. I cannot find any specificity to it. I don't know if it's true or not true. I mean, I can't find anything.
I mean, it's safe to say it's not true, because I think if this was a single person, it would be such a propaganda coup that probably by now we would know.
Well, that's fair. Yeah, it's a fair point. But like I said, it was a nice story, but I don't know. There's that much to it. So talking about Nazis in Ukraine, Azov Battalion, and all that. You want to address that?
Yeah, absolutely. It actually came up last time, and I didn't give a full expose. So Azov is a battalion part of Ukrainian armed forces. It started as a volunteer organization that definitely was very right wing in aftermath of 2014 aggression, and they were pretty open in terms of symbolism, etc. And to be honest, right now, it's very difficult to establish the true composition of the battalion. So official spokesperson for the battalion claims that they're only 10% right wing, which is I find very Russian Ukrainian way to convince people that they're not. Most people in the US probably would claim zero. But at the same time, there are several interviews with Jewish members of the battalion that are serving there and claiming that there's nothing to it. They did go through change of leadership, and they do report to Jewish president of Ukraine.
Sorry, I just find this. I just find that thing so hilarious. I'm sorry. I shouldn't giggle, right? There is a war happening. But...
Yeah, but look, I definitely believe there is some room to kind of be skeptical about the type of people and kind of what are they doing. Just to be clear, whenever there is a war, it's usually more difficult to find PhDs in science who are willing to join dangerous combat operation, and usually people who volunteer out of some strong beliefs, but not necessarily the kind of beliefs that you want to. So I kind of do not doubt that initial cohort probably held some beliefs that I would not condone.
That's fair. Okay, so let's see. Okay, that's probably something that's worth addressing. So, does Ukraine have a compulsory military service like Russia? In other words, do they have a trained pool of reservists, or do they have to quickly train new conscripts? A little bit of both, honestly. So they do have conscription, and they do have sub-professional military, and Russia is also along the same mode right now, right? So there's conscription. Everybody has to serve, but they do have professional military. In Ukrainian case, they are presumably calling up everybody who has served, and as this goes on, they will have to train people who have completely zero exposure to the military beforehand. Now, something you have to keep in mind. So neither Eugene nor I were old enough, thankfully, to have anything to do with the Russian military. Eugene served in the U.S. military. I have not. In Russia or Ukraine, presumably, having served in the military does not mean you're trained, right? So if you want to expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that basically comes down to how much money and how seriously country takes training. So nominally, both in Russia and Ukraine, you typically serve for a year and a half today. And year and a half, if this was non-stop training, is a very significant amount of time, right? Our basic training plus professional infantry school, whatever, that's 6 months for Marine Corps, less for other branches. Add another 1 full year of training, you could be in special forces qualified. But that's not how it goes. So typically, there is a very minimal boot camp. So in Russia, typically you fire AK twice during your year and a half of service. And then you do a lot of manual labor and entertain more senior people in the unit. That's kind of typically how most of it goes. So you're talking about very basic level of literacy on a level of, I don't know, that's how much my son knows about weaponry at this point.
So I will say this, right? Since normally my channel talks about guns and optics, I can say with a good degree of certainty that almost everyone who follows my YouTube channel has had more firearms training than typical Ukrainian or Russian conscript. I mean, that's definitely more experience.
Yep.
All right. Is there any heavy weapons being passed on from NATO countries besides anti-tank missiles? Have heard some ex-Soviet MiG-29s are going to Ukraine. I think we touched on this a little bit earlier. I think the MiG-29 thing somehow dissolved, unless they're coming from other sources. As far as heavy weapons, I honestly do not know. I don't know if you've heard anything. So I've heard a lot of talk about javelins and stingers, and javelin being the anti-tank missile, and stinger the anti-aircraft missile. That's sort of an old missile, but it's very, very effective. And I will say that given the way the war is going, those two are probably more critical than any heavy weaponry if you're talking about, the civilian resistance. Have you heard of anything else?
Yeah. But by the way, in terms of effectiveness, mortars, especially the kind of the ones that you can quickly deploy, motorized mortars have been super effective for Ukrainians. Stingers, from what I heard, at this point they had less than 30% hit probability. Deployed against both helicopters and low-flying planes. Javelins are at 93% hit probability, so significantly better, but it's also a more modern weapon. You would expect it to be more capable. I have not heard, obviously, Turkey supplied drones, which have been deployed. And that's the extent of what I've heard has been supplied as far as kind of weaponry.
So Turkish drones weaponized, or they are targeting surveillance drones?
No, weaponized.
They're weaponized drones. So I have not had I know they've been supplying them. I haven't looked at them. I'm not allowed to work with Turkey, so I don't know too much about their drones. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there were a few cases of footage where Russian vehicles were destroyed by Turkish drones, and there were a few claims by Russians that they destroyed a couple of drones. So clearly, they're playing their role in the conflict. You hear about them from both sides. Drone is not a fighter jet. They can typically carry one missile. I think it's not a very large drone, so you have
correct. But it's also much cheaper than the fighter jet, right? So
yes, and that's kind of another interesting point related to fighter jets. So it's great to get a jet. Operating a jet is a very different game. So 70 jets with a fuel, with parts, with kind of ammunition, being able to provide sufficient air defense for this airfield to be operational, that's kind of quite non-trivial ask. I was talking to Dima, the gentleman from Ukrainian military that was on the show last time. He claims that they still have the capability to operate them. I kind of cannot independently verify. It's definitely logistically not an easy thing to operate 70 fighter fleet.
Correct. You need landing strips and fuel and all sorts of stuff. Drones. If you can get a nice swarm of drones, you can do a lot of damage. Right. So once again, so for my day job, if you go to let's say a large army show, there's one in DC every year. I mean, the last couple of years, the single biggest topic there is anti-drone warfare. How to deal with a swarm of small drones, each carrying something slightly lethal. How do you deal with that? It's not so straightforward. And advanced nations like US and Israel have done some good job with that, but it's not exactly tested. We haven't tried that yet. I have a suspicion that if it comes to that, we can probably go buy, US can probably go buy 1 million DJI drones, put a stick of dynamite on each and send them over, and Russians have nothing to do against it, right? So, yeah, I mean, this is a good question. Well, it's not really a question, it's a statement. Mr. Pazzazi Marano says that the US is supplying hormone replacement therapy and sensitivity training to both sides, probably. All right, Jared. Eastern European countries have a deep-seated hatred of Russia, of Soviets, based on their experience with Soviet oppression. It must give the Poles, in particular, great pleasure to oppose the Russian war. First part of your statement, yeah, there's no love lost over there. Second part of the statement, I don't think anybody takes pleasure out of this, least of all Poles, who are watching militant Russia on one side and rearming Germans on the other side, right? So somebody sent me this very, I'll find it in a moment, I'll put it up on the screen, something that I've been kind of trying to address for a little while. Where is that thing? I see it. Here we go. Let me put this up on the screen so that you guys can see. There is something to consider, as a result of all of this. If you guys can see it, basically it reads, as a German, I just want to get something straight. The entire Western world wants us to build up a huge army, march through Poland, fight the Russians if needed. Just writing it down so there is no misunderstanding in the future. Okay. I don't think anybody's getting pleasure here, I'll be honest with you.
Yeah, especially if you're sitting in Poland, I do not think this is kind of case of remote war where you're watching out of pleasure of settling some score. I think you're very much concerned about kind of what's going to be the second act.
Pretty much. I mean, even with the first act, right? So I have somewhere here, I'll pull it up momentarily. If you look at the map of where Ukrainian refugees are going to, so let me put it up on the screen. Where is that thing? Here it is. Okay. So this is the map and some numbers as of March 3rd. So it's a couple of days old. Or where Ukrainian refugees are going to. As of 2 days ago, about 650,000 were already in Poland, right? And then Hungary, Moldova, a bunch of other people. 50,000 going to Russia, which is interesting. So that's probably from Eastern Ukraine. 650,000 refugees going to Poland. I assure you, all the East European countries are taking in all these refugees for one reason only. Remember, when there were refugees from North Africa and Middle East, they were all up in arms. Now they're accepting a ton of refugees. They are doing so under a distinct assumption that the war is going to over, Russia is going to go home, and the refugees are also going to go home. I don't think any of them are assuming that the refugees are there permanent. If Russia takes over Ukraine and succeeds in changing the government, they might be. Interestingly, so all these Ukrainian refugees might be solving Germany's labor problem, but for the Eastern European nations, I don't think any of this is good news. All right. This second guest always posted an interesting comment here, saying Azov, meaning the Azov battalion, is killing many Ukrainians trying to flee. I have not seen that mentioned. How about you?
No, there's not a single evidence of that. And I venture to say this is also not true.
So this also sounds very much like very standard Russian propaganda that's trying to drum up anything at all possible, no matter how outlandish sounding,
correct,
to make Ukrainians look like Nazis.
So I heard this claim in Russian propaganda in various forms. Azov specifically, Russian nationalists shooting foreign students, shooting civilians trying to flee, etc. I could not find a single instance of anybody providing photo evidence, first-hand accounts, and the fact that it appeared several times in Russian state news makes me think that that's probably both source and destination.
Very likely. Okay. All right, Joe, I watched the video on Javelin missiles. Am I good to go? Good to go to Ukraine? I don't know. I've never fired a Javelin missile. Eugene, you have any opinions on this? You can do it alone. Generally, it's a two-man team.
No, you can absolutely. I mean, it's a two-man team just because of the equipment and one guy providing security. There is no reason to have two people to fire the missile itself. It's not very difficult to learn. 15 minutes should be enough.
Okay, so Joe, I think you got your official approval. Go and list. Okay, so back to the MiGs. The problem with the MiGs is that they have no way to transport them to Ukraine, and if they would come in from Poland, this could be interpreted as Poland joining the conflict. That's what I heard. Well, given them in this that various Eastern European and Western nations are already supplying arms to Ukraine, I mean, I don't think that if they supplied a few planes, I don't think that would change the perception of what's happening. Look, if Putin, given what we know now, right, if Putin manages to pacify Ukraine and wants to drum up some good excuse to attack somebody else in Eastern Europe, I don't think we need to worry about him being able to manufacture an excuse, right? They'll figure it out. The big catch is that Poland is a NATO country, and attacking Poland would be a different ballgame altogether.
I mean, it's not outrageous consideration. Like one, it's possible to articulate exactly this as a logistical problem, as opposed to saying that countries reneged on their promise. It is possible that they're stuck at the logistical problem and they do not want to telegraph how they plan to solve it. But again, I haven't seen, there is no reason for me to trust that version over the fact that they changed their mind for any other reason.
Interesting. Okay, that's kind of an interesting question, given what my channel is normally about. If Dark Lord of Optics would have to go to war, what gun and optic would you choose if it was up to you? So I would choose some remotely operated thing like a fleet of Reaper drones sounds good to me. And the communications via satellite, I can do it without leaving home. They carry reasonable amount of armaments, good optic. You can do things from a distance. That's pretty much my personal choice. Aside from that, I've never served. I have no intention of going to war unless it comes to my house. So I don't know, Eugene, if you have any strong opinions on what you would carry to war, but I think the exact small arm probably would not be the first thing you worry about.
Well, I mean, there's two considerations. You have to obviously be comfortable with the firearm. So, like for me, AR is the most comfortable platform. The unfortunate other consideration is ammo availability, right? But I also would prefer to have something besides small arms. Like I think Javelin would actually make a bigger impact than small arms.
So Eugene, if you and I, to carry all the Javelin shit, you need two people. So you and I can probably have some small arms and carry Javelin and a few missiles.
Yeah.
And then pay the locals to actually shoot them in case there's counterfire. All right. Okay. So there we go. Now we're getting to the fun stuff. I don't understand why we don't impose serious sanctions on Russia, like banning sale of Adidas and ketchup. I think they can do without ketchup, but Adidas would be a serious problem. But Adidas being a German company, I don't think we can easily ban that. What do you think, Eugene? Is there a way to ban Adidas from Russia?
I'm assuming they're aware of the fact that Adidas was a staple of kind of Russian game.
Okay, yeah, no, fine.
So yes, it rings true to a certain subpopulation of Russia.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, talk to Mr. Slavgans. He always shows up in a red Adidas tracksuit. For a little while, you were nobody in Russia unless you had an Adidas tracksuit somehow. And when we were growing up, every once in a while you could get some Adidas like sneakers, kind of like soccer shoes. And if you had a pair, I mean, that means you were just one step removed from being the general secretary of the Communist Party. Okay, that's interesting. William Brown. Russian North Star Airlines has midnight Sunday to turn in essentially all the aircraft they run. The banks called the loans in. Boeing and Airbus have pulled support from Russia. So I'm not familiar with Russia's North Star Airlines, but it's not surprising. I mean, there is all sorts of stuff being pulled and canceled, airspace being closed to Russian airlines and stuff like that. I don't know. Okay, second guess always. Sanctions only hurt the people, not the politicians. That's actually kind of a loaded topic. You want to tackle this one?
Sure. Look, those concerns come up all the time, and anybody who has been in combat, they can overthink this to death. A person shooting at you, are they fully aware of the political situation? Do they understand who they're fighting for and why? Do they have a family at home, etc.? Reality is kind of simple. You have an enemy to defeat. and you first worry about defeating the enemy, then kind of the state of their comfort and so on. So no, I do not believe the statement as stated is correct. Obviously, it hurts both. But I also do not believe there is a way to selectively just hurt politicians who control the population and are able to obviously exercise both financial redistribution means that they see fit, etc. So I do not know how to do one without the other. Absolutely, it hurts people, yes. At the same time, I do not know what it would mean to fight Second World War against a close circle of Nazi allies, but not the broader German military or industry.
Correct. In a sense, you're right. Yeah, politicians do mischief and regular people suffer. You are correct. But war is dirty and unpleasant business, and it's supposed to hopefully teach a lesson to at least democratic countries that you should be careful who you elect. All right, let's see what else we have. Going back to the troubles of gun loonies in the United States, guilty as charged. The sanction stuff makes me relieved. I went over from surplus guns to AR-15s and NATO calibers. The ammo scene today, well, I found stuff I was looking for was terrible. So Eugene lives in California, so if you want to talk about ammo scene, you should talk to him. I am good for a few decades, but I think it's easier to find NATO ammo in Ukraine than in California right now.
I'm okay. It's
Yeah,
it
you're
requires
fine.
jumping through some hoops, but it's still available.
So interesting. So Second Guess always says that about the Azov killing, retreating Ukrainians, says he got this from uncle in Odessa. I assume that's what he's referring to. You know what? I'll see if I can find any real verifiable information, right?
Let me guess where the uncle got it from. So I hear the stories ricocheting kind of secondhand through my parents' generation, especially where they watch Russian TV predominantly. That's what they grew up with, and they repeat the stories. I would be, again, like never say never. Obviously, surprising things and unpleasant things happen at war. I would be surprised if there is actually any evidence to this. What I would not be surprised is that there is somebody, especially older gentleman in Odessa, that's watching Russian TV and repeating the news. And in fact, we have friends from Odessa who are my age. Their parents are older age, and they have arguments about this kind of things, where kind of their parents do not believe their own eyes. They believe that things are happening that they watch on TV, but not the things that people around them are saying. So again, like yes, I cannot argue with uncle that I do not know in Odessa. My prior is that source of this information is still Russian media, but happy to be proven wrong.
That is extremely likely. Okay, let's talk about nuclear for a little bit. What is your take on global nuclear arms increase due to the failure of 2 of the 5 superpowers lying to the Ukrainian government? I'm not sure what the 5 superpowers are. There's really just one right now, and China is trying to get there. But I see your point. It sounds like having nuclear weapons is the one thing that a country can use as a reasonable guarantee that they're not going to get invaded. I think the question comes down to thoughts.
I mean, we already seeing kind of proliferation directly as a result of this war. Japan expressed interest in nuclear weapons on the Western side. Belarus agreed to host Russian nuclear weapons on kind of pro-Russian side. Basically, watching how the West is being very reluctant to show material help to Ukraine. I think you would be silly not to seek nuclear weapon.
So are you trying to tell me that apparently the wanted NATO threat to Russia and all that sort of stuff is not looking like a particularly reliable thing that you could use to defend your own country?
Well, Ukraine had one better. They had a letter signed by both Russia and Ukraine.
Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about that. That must be framed and gold crusted. Yeah, it's we will see. Germany they didn't say anything about nuclear weapons. They said they will rearm, and they also said they will extend the service of their nuclear power stations. So Germany has finally seems to have figured out that the Green Party has steered them wrong, and they'll pay a little bit more attention to nuclear. Then there is Japan, and if Ukraine comes out of it in one piece, they should be out of North Korea shopping for a nuke, because I don't think if Putin does not succeed in Ukraine right now, there's a really good chance this is not the last attempt, right? Okay. Jack Bauer, how realistic is it that the sanctions will create internal public pressure for Putin, or will it just be sold as an attack by the West on the Russian people by Russian propaganda? So on the second part of this question, yeah, it is absolutely being sold to the Russian people as a propaganda tool that the West is attacking them, and the West is attacking them, right? The sanction is an attack on Russia. The question is that are they sanctioning Russia just for the heck of it, or because Russia has invaded Ukraine, right? So it's kind of a chicken and an egg thing. As far as internal public pressure for Putin goes, Eugene talked about this, and I'll let him chime in momentarily. But it's Putin doesn't seem to give a rat's ass about public pressure, but the pressure on the really wealthy Russian politicians and oligarchs, will that play a role, right? And it might. So I really don't know. What do you think?
Well, there are a few scenarios that I'm concerned about. Scenario number one is that everybody in such a rush to relieve the financial pressure. So if Putin says, yes, we're stopping the war under acceptance of Crimea, independence of Donetsk, Lugansk, disarmament of Ukraine, the whole pressure is going to be removed. To me, this is one failure mode that, in my mind, just allows him to live to fight another day. The other scenario that I'm concerned about, that this is a little bit of a Germany under Versailles situation after a few years, where kind of people feel humiliated and attacked, and if nothing changes over a prolonged period of time, there is going to be a genuine resentment that may lead to genuine interest in conflict on the Russian side. But this is kind of, that concern is not for today.
Interesting. So real quick, a technical issue. I just got a note from StreamYard that they're having a hard time communicating with Facebook, and they think the issues with on Facebook's end. I'm looking at it. There is no live signal going into Facebook. I don't know if they killed us, the stream or not, but we're still live on YouTube, so we'll just continue. And if Facebook did kill the live cast, I am also recording the video, and if it dies somewhere, I'll put it up on Rumble and post a link. Okay.
Out of the more humorous evidence for Azov, I'm kind of posting this Twitter from Donetsk, and to me, this is the kind of propaganda type of things that.
Okay, let me pull it up.
I fully believe Russia can manufacture and do manufacture. So, yeah, I mean, again, like I could see how some people find it persuasive because they haven't seen it before. They have not seen the pattern, but I don't find this evidence super credible.
So I'm posting a link to the Twitter post Eugene is mentioning in the comments.
Yeah, as long as people understand that I'm posting it as not credible evidence as opposed to endorsing the narrative.
Correct. Let me clarify that. For the Twitter post, just a bunch of propaganda. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, all sorts of interesting stuff's happening. And is YouTube still dead? Can't see. Yeah, YouTube says this live video has ended. So apparently, YouTube decided to end the live video on my behalf. Okay, that happens. Okay, YouTube's still here, so we'll press on. That's a good question. How bad do you think gas and food prices will get in the US? Well, I mean, I don't think we care about food that much. Food prices will only go up as much as transportation costs go up, right? So gas prices will go up. It's very hard to say. It will go up, but if we don't start drilling here, if we don't resume domestic oil and gas production to a significant degree, it can go up a good bit. And what do you think? 20%, 15%?
Yeah, I do not have enough knowledge of economics of oil pricing. It's 7% of US oil, and US can clearly achieve oil independence if they want to.
Well, I mean,
So
US had oil independence in 2020 before Biden got into the office and pulled the leases for
that's
drilling on
right.
public land.
So in that sense, I would claim that it's 100% in our control. Maybe not within
Mhm.
a week, but within a few months.
But I mean, okay. So the way this happens, right? If let's say hypothetically, it's not going to happen, but hypothetically, Biden goes and announces that we are renewing the leases, drill away, etc. Not a single drop of oil has been extracted from the ground, but oil prices already drop, right? So because the news gets priced in, so and that will have a fairly immediate effect on our gas and food prices, right? The effect is sufficient by just starting the efforts, right? Mr. Pazazamaran, the Russians drink as much Kool-Aid as American leftists or right-wingers that think Putin is fighting Klaus Schwab. It's hard to evaluate how much Kool-Aid people are really drinking, but it's not an unreasonable statement, I think. Actually, it's a good point. So, Eugene, based on everything we've covered so far, do Russians still have some reasonable faith in their government and in the news services, or it's 50-50, right? It's got to be.
Yeah, it depends who. So again, just to be clear, this is a subject of pretty heated debates within Russia itself and the Russian expatriate community. Some people err strongly. So I believe that majority of Russians still believe and support to a sufficient degree. That does not mean that they don't necessarily think that there is corruption taking place at higher echelons, but overall they still buy the narrative, right? With all the reservations and everybody's corrupt, but there is something to it. And there is clearly a set of people who are willing to go to jail for protesting, and I'm sure there is much larger fraction that are not willing to quite go to that extent, but have nothing to do with narrative. So my guess would be 70% buy narrative to sufficient degree, and third, they probably do not buy it.
Okay, probably reasonable. All right, so this is interesting. So Bitcoin stops the pressure to the oligarchs. I don't know if it stops the pressure. It just means they can move some finances around, right? You'd probably know more about Bitcoin than I do. There were some interesting statements by Bitcoin people who they were asked to sanction the Russian oligarchs, and at least the head of one of the companies said if they were sanctioning people for political reasons, they'd start with everybody in America. I think I heard that somewhere. Any thoughts on how Bitcoin plays into this?
I mean, your statement is correct. I would agree that if Bitcoin starts playing politics, there is no reason to have Bitcoin, period. So it's very unfortunate, but that's kind of baked into the cake. The whole point is that they're apolitical. They're not subject to pressure of the governments. If they become just another form of controlled currency, what's the utility? Now, it is very volatile. If you actually want to do real transactions in Bitcoins, that's going to be quite painful. And just looking at the Bitcoin price, there is no indication that they're going through some tremendous revival, etc. Because I don't think that this is sufficient means for actually transacting business.
Yeah, that's right. The volatility of Bitcoin is so high that it's not a reliable way to move money without losing money.
Also, the speed of transaction is nowhere near where it needs to be. So there are a few kind of material obstacles.
Okay. So Mr. Liberal Tears, I think, joined late because we talked a little bit about how much oil, Russian oil, U.S. is still buying. So it's not $1 million barrels per day. I think Eugene had a number that he pulled up, but 209,000 barrels per day of crude oil and 500,000 barrels per day of other petroleum products. So close to a million, not quite a million. Sanctions do hurt everybody in Russia, not just regular people, and we should stop buying Russian oil at this stage. And you are absolutely correct. The White House is beyond incompetent. To be fair, though, it was beyond incompetent before Russia invaded Ukraine. Just nothing there has changed.
By the way, kind of the interesting thought related to Putin's money and how much money he has. I think that kind of the general notion of him having bank account with money is very much irrelevant. I think that for him, every threat is existential. There is no chance that Putin can retire somewhere living off his billions of dollars. So either he's in control, having as much money as he can get from Russia, which is a lot, or he's dead. There is really nothing in between.
There's no retirement for Putin. But on the other hand, there is Putin's family, right?
Yes, there is Putin's family, and I think that, well, again, there is definitely some way to hide money, but the other parts of sanction, difficulty traveling, difficulty to have normal transactions, will impact them quite a bit. Again, not existential threat like what Putin himself experiences, but I do think those bite.
Yeah, that's fair. Bal Infinity. Food prices are a big deal to most people I talk to these days. Real costs of your grocery bill have gone up at least 30% in a year. Yeah, and it's just quite kind of a big deal, but the catch is that I don't think that's, so far at least, has been strongly influenced by the war with Ukraine. The war with Ukraine might push it up higher since oil prices are going up and transportation costs are going up. But inflation has been in the US has been out of control already, right? It's something to do with our public policies. Mike, gas will go down before November. It's a cynical, probably accurate way of looking at things. It will go down before the November election. And Mr. Liberal Tears, if they wanted to hurt Putin, they would start producing oil here, ban NATO from purchasing Russian oil, or pull out of the agreement. Okay, NATO doesn't purchase Russian oil. We can't ban anyone. We can't prevent anyone. We can convince them. Right.
Just to be clear, the issue is not our desire or lack of such to punish Putin. The issue is that there are kind of conflicting political pressures. Keystone pipeline was shut down not because we wanted to help Putin, and Germany did not shut down its nuclear power plants to help Putin. This is kind of Green Party in case of Germany, and environmental movement in case of United States. And obviously, I think this is...
But it's the same kind of communist, I mean.
Right. I think it's a very silly mistake because you're ultimately not changing the source of your energy, even if that's your main priority, but you're trading off independence politically for kind of much more dependent economy on somebody you should not be dependent on.
That's a very fair point. Okay. So Chris Morlock, if NATO countries were banned from purchasing Russian energy, they would be in the dark instantly. 30%, 35% of Europe's gas comes from Russia. Yep, that's a fair point. And that was a absolute strategic blunder on the part of European countries.
And that's the reason why Angela Merkel is experiencing huge backlash. She was very much a popular figure up until this crisis, and now it becomes very clear that she miscalculated on several very major aspects of foreign policy and internal policy when it comes to energy.
To put it mildly, I mean, something that's not reasonably, doesn't get enough coverage, in my opinion, is that Gerhard Schröder, who was the General Chancellor of Germany before Angela Merkel, he has become a gas lobbyist. He's on board of a Russian state gas company. I mean,
and he refused to remove himself from the board. At least that was the last statement.
Okay. Okay, that's actually interesting. From Mr. Pazazzi Morano. Russia produces huge amount of fertilizer, and the price of feed in the US more than doubled for farmers. That actually I didn't know. That's an interesting point. That will have an effect, certainly. But it's a short-term effect. I mean, we'll find other sources of fertilizer. Okay, that's just funny. The problem is that Americans are so fat. By the way, I'm taking that one personally. And they can actually benefit from eating less. This might even decrease the amount of bankruptcy in the Medicare system. Nobody appreciates my drive to achieve geometric perfection because round is a geometrically perfect shape. Okay, what else we have? Angela Merkel was an East German. She learned foreign policy from the Soviet Union. Excuse me. Angela Merkel was indeed the very first German chancellor to be originally from Eastern Europe. I don't think she learned foreign policy from the Soviet Union, but you would think that given that, she would have had a better grasp of how to deal with Russia, but that turns out to not have been the case.
I mean, she's, as any kind of reasonable politician, she has both very positive thing one can say about her tenure and very negative things. So foreign policy was not what I would consider positive in my mind. What she did do, which I do not see happening in the United States for multiple years, is actually holding cabinet accountable. So she would dismiss people for incompetence. And this is something that sounds very foreign to me, having spent many years in the United States.
Okay, so I'm looking at our pre-short notes. Excuse me, and I will add them to the video description later after we're done. There are a couple of things that we kind of pointed out that we haven't yet covered. So, question number one. So, what is the current state of Russian military capabilities? How would you describe that? So, what are they still capable of, not capable of? How do they compare to first world militaries? I mean,
yeah, it's very difficult to tell because me as well as kind of many others were surprised by level of their failure at the first stages of the war. Even if you look at the numbers of elite units that Russia has, those numbers are not small. Now, once you start digging a little bit under the hood, similar how kind of we have Marine Corps and how many people are actual combat units within Marine Corps versus supply versus modern transportation, etc. There is similar pattern with paratroopers and Russian Marines, which primarily contract at this point. So at least my assessment today, and I could be wrong, is that probably all of the most capable units were thrown in, except for the fraction that Russia believes they need to keep in reserve for state security reasons. Right now, most of the units joining the fight, not all, but most are conscripts, and they do have a lot of conscripts, and it's very easy to produce more conscripts. Their utility is rapidly diminishing. If you saw videos of Russian vehicles that have no encrypted communication capabilities, they this is not T-90s and Armata tanks that you see in Russian parades. Those T-72s and kind of the older version of those as well. So most likely we're looking at militarily technical capabilities of the 70s with fairly low level of training. Now, that said, that's still a lot of firepower. So Russian tanks were never known for their technology or capability. They were known for numbers. So numbers they still have. And depending how you want to interpret the 40-mile convoy going towards Kiev, this demonstrates the capability.
Yeah, I keep looking at that 40-mile convoy and thinking, what if we could send American Air Force in there? How much fun they could have had with such a concentrated bunch of land-based hardware.
Yeah, that's.
But we can only dream.
Yeah.
All right. So moving on. Given that, right? So we touched on this a little bit. What kind of assistance do Ukrainians need to continue the fight? Humanitarian aid, weapon systems.
Yes. So I'm kind of, my major concerns are related to supply as much as the will to help. Can we actually get the right supplies to the right place? And a lot of it is very banal things: medical aid, food, small arms, ammunitions, the types of things that don't sound as sexy as drones, but are very, very critical if you are under prolonged siege. So currently, Kyiv is not encircled, but I still do not know what that means in terms of being able to move convoy of trucks into the Kyiv area. So clearly, anti-tank missiles have been critical, and they've been put to very good use. Anti-air capability is also very critical, and I think they play about similar role that they played in Afghanistan during Soviet invasion, where it wasn't necessarily a huge number of planes that they downed, but the Soviets were very concerned about using planes, period. So the typical situation, what we're used to in joint arms combat scenario, was not exercised because they did not want to lose planes and are willing to throw more ground troops because those are relatively cheap. So I think there's a little bit of a similar situation happening in Ukraine as well, where it is clear that there is no close air support the way we would interpret it. There is aerial bombardment, there are occasional sorties, etc. In terms of fighters, maybe, if I trust kind of the few people who may have some knowledge, there is still opportunity to operate them. There was explicit ask for A-10s, which first thing that comes to Western mind when you think of 40-mile convoy. Unfortunately, I think that's kind of non-starter. You need to train.
Western air forces are not going to be going into that, right? So there's
not for planes, not for planes with the force, but it's kind of almost irrelevant. You need technicians who know how to operate it. You need pilots who are trained on it. You need ammo for this. That's probably too much of a logistical problem.
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Moran is going. Being realistic, Ukrainians need the West to close the airspace. It's only a matter of time until Russians deploy mass casualty weapons and start leveling cities completely. You are correct, but in practical terms, I don't see any will in the West to do that. So there is that kind of gets us to sort of the last question I was going to bring up, and then, we'll address a couple more comments and wrap up, is that what are the possible outcomes of this conflict and when? And what is the next logical step? And I'm afraid the next logical step is what you're mentioning here, mass casualty weapons. We're not seeing that yet, but we're inching in that direction, right?
Yes. So me personally, I think that yes, it is a dangerous step, but it's a warranted step to close airspace. But to be clear, it's also extremely difficult logistical step. This is not a matter of declaration. You need to move the assets in the bordering regions. You need to have defense capabilities to protect those assets. You need to have ground personnel to protect those defense capabilities. Basically, we're talking about full-scale deployment to do this. And
if you want to close Ukrainian airspace, you're talking about an aircraft carrier going to the Black Sea.
That would, aircraft carrier group probably would not be sufficient to close whole Ukraine. I mean, it could do some damage, but
on one side that, on the other side you have, the Baltic, the NATO countries where you can station stuff, right?
Well, anyways, I think this is probably a debate that we should have with somebody who actually had experience issuing orders of closing airspace. But my question is, kind of aircraft carriers, sufficient capability, where would you place it? Black Sea, which is mainly Russian backyard at this point. That sounds pretty risky proposition for multiple reasons. Mediterranean is kind of far.
That's too far. You could do Baltic, but you have to fly over Belarus.
By the way, state of Belarus in this conflict is also very interesting because it's technically still not a belligerent party, but I'm not sure why. In terms of kind of providing basis and voicing support, as far as I'm concerned, I would consider them a belligerent party as well.
All good points. So, when do you think, in terms of timeline, when do you think we'll see some major changes? Where's your crystal ball?
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer. So initially, Pentagon claimed that Ukraine will last 4 to 6 weeks. Right now, most likely this estimate increased by a factor of 2 or 3. But it's all predicated on Russia being willing to escalate to kind of mass casualties using more aerial weapons. And we've seen this escalation. We haven't seen it to full extent of Russian capabilities, which is both very unpleasant thought, but also a fairly realistic thought.
Okay, so 4 to 6 weeks. So by the time we get to the November election, this all this Ukrainian bloc party might still be happening. Okay. And Mr. Pazazi Marano. As Russians become more desperate, this will turn more into genocide than a war. Genocide is a very specific term, meaning extermination of, in this case, I assume Ukrainians. I don't know if it will turn into genocide, but it will turn into an extremely bloody war. So, and the next comment is, I think we need to put our balls there, and if he wants a nuclear war, then let's see what he has. We need Cold War saber-rattling diplomacy of suicidal psychopaths. That is an interesting statement. And, on the surface, not as simple as it sounds really on the surface of it, right? So Putin is sort of rattling his saber and increasing the readiness for his nuclear forces and all that sort of stuff. How are we supposed to react to that? Do we just then, let him have Ukraine because he threatened the use of nuclear weapons? What would prevent him then from, shake his nuclear missiles again and take over the next country, right? How do you deal with that? The saber rattling with nuclear weapons really works when you have rational actors on both sides. And Putin, at least, is behaving, trying to show that he is no longer a rational actor, hoping that will help him. And he may or may not be, and we don't know. Right?
My expectation that he is still fairly far from committing nuclear weapons. I think it's mainly bluster. I agree that nobody knows for sure. So when I'm talking about ability to establish control over airspace, this definitely would be considered an act of war by Russia. Yet I still do not think they would go nuclear as a result.
That's fair. So do you think we will get to a point where Western nations say screw this and get involved, let's say close the airspace?
Well, I think this is not the case where politicians are leading public opinion, but the other way around. You saw that both the United States and Europe were very timid until they saw the reality of war. And now kind of a lot of this timidity is gone. Biden mentioned he'll revisit sanctions in 1 month. It took him less than a week, right? So there is a chance that if more imagery and kind of more carnage is seen on a public stage, they actually will be much more willing to back closing airspace. I think even today, the proposition to close airspace enjoys popular support in the US.
Okay.
I may need to verify it, but I think I was reading about it somewhere.
Okay, so here's an interesting comment. This gentleman is from Russia, I assume, although the name sounds Finnish, but he was commenting on our previous discussion in very good Russian. So he says one thing here: Russians don't care about closing airspace. You don't listen to Putin again. Interesting comment. I'm not sure what to make of it. Thoughts?
I'm curious what the gentleman, I assume, meant by Russians don't care about closing airspace. You're talking about closing airspace for civilian planes. That is true.
You're
think
correct. They don't care about that.
Yeah,
we're talking about closing. So how about do this? Please clarify what you mean. You can do so in English or in Russian. Пожалуйста, объясните, что вы имеете в виду, по-русски или по-английски, я потом переведу.
Yeah, sorry. If it was unclear to anybody, we talked about closing airspace, which in my mind is synonymous to no-fly zone over Ukraine, meaning that everything that flies in Ukrainian air gets shut down. Russia very much cares about that because I do not believe they can conduct war under this scenario. So in terms of closing flights for Russian tourists to go to Turkey, yes. Well, first of all, they still can go to Turkey. They cannot go to many other places, but that's true. This was baked into the cake. Like it causes significant annoyance, but I do not believe this itself will change Putin's mind.
Okay. Right. Let's see if he clarifies what exactly he means, and we'll go from there. All right, Eugene, anything from our original discussion or the notes that you think we haven't covered? I think we got most of it.
Yeah, I think we talked a little bit about Russian casualties. Interestingly enough, it's actually more difficult to get any firm estimate of Ukrainian casualties. So the same website that said that Russia lost 725 pieces of ground equipment claims that Ukraine lost 229. So you have more than something like 2.5 ratio there, which sounds plausible. Russia has definitely exaggerated estimates of losses on Ukrainian manpower. I think they were claiming 6,000 3 days ago. That's not generally unbelievable under any circumstances, but I do not think it's a credible number given kind of realities on the ground and the fact that everything that Russia says you need to adjust. So if they're claiming the lost 500, and I believe that the correct number probably will be closer to 3,000, then I think that kind of Ukrainian losses should be revised in the opposite direction. So if they're saying 6,000, maybe it's possible that Ukraine lost 1,500, 2,000.
Okay. So we got another question here from Ball Infinity, more of a statement. I think there is a better chance that if the West decides to actually go to war with Russia, and the no-fly zone is a hot war, the Russians may decide to use tactical nuclear weapons, which could escalate. Well, so Eugene thinks that's unlikely, that Putin is not crazy enough.
Yeah, just to be clear, so I do not have a crystal ball. I cannot say this is unlikely, though I do think the probability is extremely low. It's not that Putin is not crazy. Putin's mental state increasingly becomes something of a question. People around him have too much to lose. So it's unlikely that they will be able to maintain power if they decide to deploy nuclear weapons.
Okay, so I'm gonna pull this up. The gentleman who asked the question earlier in English said it in Russian, and I'll translate it. What he says is Putin said that they will do a strike, I assume a nuclear strike, in either case, whether it's NATO or a non-NATO country doing this, if there is an effort to close the airspace for the Russian military aviation. And he said that without any conditional statement, which is very worrying. Спасибо за то, что пояснили. Я, если честно, я не знаю, что об этом сказать. Мне кажется, что он не настолько сошел с ума, но мне тяжело сказать. So what I just said is that I'm sort of with Eugene here. I don't think he's that nuts. And there is more than just one person making that decision. But that is possible.
It's also not clear what tactical nukes buy you other than this is just a form of escalation. This does not improve your chances of kind of controlling territory or submitting population. It's easy to control.
Yeah, I mean, to that effect. So Jared's question: if Putin did use nuclear weapons even smaller tactical versions, what would you expect the reaction from the West to be? What would push NATO over the edge? Oh, good question, really. I mean, I would think that nuclear anything and we go full blast. But I don't know what that really means, right? Maybe that means Germans marching across Poland and engaging Russia. Maybe that's the response.
Well, if he goes nuclear, we're definitely suspending Nord Stream 2 pipeline. You can forget about that being built next month.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, I think that Putin is being very direct and threatening in terms of his escalation, which in my mind is just his correct read on who he is fighting with. He knows that those resonate in the West. Versus West did everything they could not to outline very clear red lines and escalation strategy. And kind of Biden was the best example pre-war, where he tried to describe kind of only tip strategy, where, well, then maybe it's not that bad, and then if he goes all in, then we'll think much harder about it. There is no clarity. So to be honest, I do not know what would it take for the United States or anybody in the West to execute nuclear strike against Russia. I kind of do not believe they would do it as a result of tactical nuclear strike in Ukraine, but they probably would escalate somehow.
Correct. Fair point. Azazimaran, if Putin uses any nuke, I think that will be the end of Russia. Quite possibly, but now we are we're going into a territory that has been talked about for decades and never explored. We really don't know. That's very new territory. We don't know.
I'm curious what people mean by end of Russia in a sense of kind of internal collapse due to popular uprising, U.S. military marching into the Russia. Those I still do not find super credible. Again, my main scenario is that somebody inside his first or second tier circle decides enough is enough. For instance, he is chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, which he removed. Like, this would be the kind of disgruntled person that I could see wielding sufficient influence.
So, okay, that's a fair point. If I were to make a bet on how this is going to end, is that somebody from the inner circle is going to off Putin and assume power? Because I don't, like I said, when we're talking about how this conflict can end, I can't, hard as I try, I don't see how this can end well for Putin. Okay, can you visualize anything that would be a win for Putin out of this one at this stage?
Yes, coming to negotiation table. Look, there is a very unfortunate trade-off that West would have to make. There are real people dying today, and continuing conflict means that you realistically believe that more people will die in the future unless there is some semblance of victory, which is a very difficult statement to make for sure. So I could see Putin negotiating way out, getting Crimea, Lugansk, Donetsk, assurances of Ukraine not joining NATO, and then he can go back to his constituents and say this is kind of close enough to what I was hoping to achieve, and for the sake of peace, I'm willing to live with this uneven trade-off, and sanctions going to be lifted because it's going to be viewed as him seeing the light of day, yeah, I could see that.
It's possible, but given the vigor of current Ukrainian popular resistance, I'm not sure how likely it is yet. But a few weeks of carpet bombing and it might change.
Well, so right now negotiations are collapsing, but I do not know what exactly is being said and who is the one who is pulling it off, etc. So Russia blames Ukraine. Ukraine claims that Russia still demands basically full surrender, which they're not willing to go for. Yeah, I do not know how that's going to continue. So my claim is that Putin still can negotiate the way out, given desire for people to have peace at any price.
Okay, that's fair. So Jack is commenting that I think as long as he's supplying gas to the West and begging the money, he will not start a nuclear apocalypse. Perhaps I'm not convinced at this stage. It's all about Putin begging the money. I think he's doing well enough. But I also do not believe that he will start a nuclear apocalypse. All right, guys, I think we've been at it for a couple of hours, and I will put up a comment here that I think is genuinely very pertinent, aside from the Ukraine business. As this is from Joe Morgan. I've personally had one key takeaway from this: be armed, be prepared, have food, water, meds, skills, ammo, fuel, etc. That's a relevant. Statement, regardless of what's happening in Ukraine. Generally, good to have food, water, guns, ammo, skills, and things like that. But I do not think this war is going to come to the United States, no matter what happens. And let's see. Oh, okay. So just before we wrap up, Brooks Precision, and then Finland joined. I think you're talking about Finland and Sweden restarting their conversation to join NATO. So William Brown here said that Putin brought UN back to life. I don't think Putin brought United Nations back to life. United Nations is basically useless. Well, worse than useless. I think Eugene can talk very eloquently about United Nations. You had a very nice Facebook post the other way. I was thinking of stealing it. But Putin definitely revitalized NATO, right? NATO has been this assembly of a bunch of countries who don't see eye to eye most of the time, and now with Putin getting muscular again, NATO has meaning once again, right? So I think in terms of NATO, this is accurate. In terms of UN, Eugene, you can chime in on that one.
Well, in terms of NATO, I'm assuming that, sorry, I don't see the name, that gentleman is referring to the fact that Germany decided to raise its military budget above 2%, and kind of some other countries verbally committed to some moves. Now, let's see it happen. So first of all, proclamation is not yet action. Number two, we have few countries such as UK that I believe is above 2% of GDP, but the way they achieve it is by kind of very generously counting pensions and other type of payments as part of the military budget. Also, there is a question of whether the money is actually going to be spent correctly, meaning that we're looking for interoperability of the equipment, having kind of established processes, etc., versus, again, this is being kind of isolated example. So I'm kind of definitely moving in the right direction. Not enough to make me a believer yet. In terms of UN, I have a very skeptical view of UN for very long time. I think UN was able to successfully not intervene in every chance it had. Obviously, Rwanda genocide comes to mind as an example of fairly not complicated operation, very, how should I say this, kind of very easy to judge political situation where they managed not to take action in time. Ukraine is yet another example, which you have Russia presiding over Security Council as it's attacking a sovereign state. So there is something wrong with the way organization is functioning. Let's put it this way.
Well, look, but as far as humor goes, I think it's good. I mean,
yeah, I don't know. Like you hear the same joke over and over again, and you're like, we need a new joke.
That's a fair point. All right, so we're going to wrap up. I will take one last comment, and it's on the screen. It's from Mr. Axel Pervalainen. The comment is in Russian. I'll read it out in Russian. I'll translate it, and then I'll let Eugene handle it, and then we'll wrap up. Что-то произошло такое, что Путин даже не рассматривает переговоров с НАТО. Окончание войны возможно только в том случае, если НАТО вернется на границы 1997 года. Translation. So something happened that Putin is not even considering negotiations with NATO. The end of the war is only possible if NATO returns to its 1997 borders. So I'll let Eugene think about it for a moment and start addressing it. I'll pull that map up on the screen that actually shows which nations joined NATO when, and that will give a little bit of a background for this question statement.
I mean, I think it's a reasonable statement. I happen to disagree with it completely. I think that one, kind of on a moral level, I do not believe that Russia has the right to demand who is within Russian sphere of influence and who is not. And NATO is basically assurance for democratic countries. They're not going to be steamrolled at the first opportunity by Russia. This is the only reason why countries join NATO. Otherwise, there is absolutely no reason to deal with kind of bureaucratic apparatus of NATO, being forced to spend more money on defense, etc. Also, I do think it's a little bit of a pretext. If it's not that, it would be something else. I think this is kind of not the true agenda. Russia is not being threatened by NATO. I think objectively it's not the case. It's quite possible that few people have convinced themselves that this is a problem, but looking at reality of what NATO is, it's difficult to understand.
Well, it sounds like half of Russians convinced themselves that's the case. I think that's wrong. NATO has no real offensive capability.
Correct. So the Russian media definitely convince significant portion of Russians. Question is people who are in charge, to what degree they believe this is the true story, or they want to revive Soviet Union, in which case kind of whether you're part of NATO or not is less relevant. What's relevant is whether Russia views you as their rightful sphere of influence. So Poland, Czech Republic, Eastern Germany, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, kind of all of those countries from Putin's standpoint are the ones that got away. Okay. And yeah, it's very difficult for me to...
So to be blunt, if you look at the map here, so everything, so Germany, this line, if you see my mouse, that is the 1997 border of NATO. All the countries to the right, Czech Republic, Poland, the Yugoslavian countries, the Baltics, they all joined NATO after 1997. The basic claim here is that the war will only stop if the West agrees to go back to the essential situation with the original Iron Curtain. This is where the Iron Curtain was, right? So this was the Soviet sphere of influence, and the rest was the US Western sphere of influence. To be blunt, pardon me? Splitting Germany, excuse me, except for that, right? Thank you for that. To be blunt, Russia can claim whatever the hell they want. They do not have the power.
Look, I do believe that states have some sovereignty, and
Correct.
It's not reasonable for Russia or US to decide that Poland falls under Russian sphere of influence and Russia should be able to install dictator whenever they feel like it, which is the situation with Ukraine right now. So either you believe in principle of self-determination or you do not.
Or you don't. But I mean, if you don't believe in self-determination, then it's not the West anymore, right? One of the very, very fundamental things of the Western culture, Western way of life. We disagree and fight about things all the time, but self-determination is really paramount. And I do not think that's going to go. And Mr. Alex Pervalainen saying, then the show must go on. I don't think the show must go on. Honestly, I think Russia will lose this one. I'll be honest with you. I don't think it's going to, Eugene thinks it's going to be some sort of diplomatic solution. I doubt it. I think Russia would basically run out of resources and retreat in the end. It's going to be, Ukraine's independence will be bought with blood of a very large number of Ukrainians and Russians. I have serious doubts that talks will do anything here, unless, once again, there is a change of the regime in Russia, basically palace coup. It's either palace coup or long bloody war that Russia does not have the economy to sustain. That's basically it. Soviet Union collapsed because it could not economically compete with the West. Neither can Russia. It'll be change of power or long bloody war where everybody goes bankrupt, except for us.
I don't know. I feel like there is too much desire in the West to come to the negotiation table at the last mile, when Russia will feel like they almost lost. Yes, or
the US will. I try to say that Biden and company will not fail to pull a defeat from the jaws of victory.
That's right. Yeah, that's kind of
that's very possible. The optimist in me hopes not, but you may very well be right. Oh, that's an interesting question. So I'm not going to address this. This would be a good topic for a follow-up at some point. No change in power. NATO always needs a bad guy. That's fair, I guess. Well, I will address it then. For NATO to exist, you need a bad guy. I don't think NATO was looking for a bad guy. I think a bad guy just showed up, reminding us why NATO exists.
I mean, I guess NATO is not an organization in search of anything. Most of the countries are happy to cut their defense budget and let NATO essentially rot away, which is what was happening for the last 25 years at least. Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a wake-up call, but I do not believe that NATO has a will of itself to create an enemy.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So if there's anything we did not address, please put it in the comments under the video, and I'll do my best. Eugene, any parting thoughts before we wrap this up?
No, we covered a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I think this was good. Thank you for joining me. Thank you all for sticking with us for these 2 hours. I really enjoyed the conversation. Good questions. Thank you all. And if anything fun happens and Eugene has time, maybe we'll do this next weekend. Until then, if anything interesting perks up, you know where to find me. Post a question under the video and I'll do my best to address it. Thank you. And you have a good rest of your weekend.